There is a frequency that the universe has always broadcast, 1.42 gigahertz, the hydrogen line. The most abundant element in existence, spinning and humming across every galaxy, every nebula, every cold stretch of dark matter between the stars, singing its quiet electromagnetic note into the void. Scientists have known about it for decades. They point their dishes at the sky. They open their receivers to that narrow band of cosmic noise, and they listen. They listen because if anything out there, anything intelligent, anything designed, anything capable of purpose, were going to choose a channel on which to speak, it would choose the one channel that any civilization advanced enough to build a radio telescope would already be monitoring. It would choose the hydrogen line. It would choose 1.42 gigahertz. And for decades mostly, what they heard was nothing. Background hiss, stellar static, the slow, meaningless conversation of atoms with themselves. But on the morning of October 17th, 2009, something changed. And nothing. Not the scientists who first noticed it. Not the agencies that quietly archived it. Not the engineers who spent the better part of a year trying to explain it away. Nothing has ever quite been the same since. The Western Australia facility sits far from everything. That is, of course, the point. You want silence when you're trying to listen to the cosmos. You want flat earth and open sky and the absence of the electromagnetic pollution that cities and highways and power lines generate in their constant, indifferent drone. The array there is not glamorous. It is not the famous dish at Arecibo. Its enormous bowl cradled in a Puerto Rican valley. It is not the romantic sprawl of the very large array in New Mexico. Those great white ears tilted to the heavens in perfect geometric harmony. The Australian facility is functional, industrial almost, a cluster of antenna dishes arrayed across pale red earth, surrounded by scrubland and silence, operated largely by remote systems that churn through data with algorithmic patience, flagging anomalies for human review, according to parameters set long before any particular shift begins. On most days, nothing gets flagged. The universe is enormous and largely indifferent to the particular sliver of frequency range that any given instrument is designed to monitor. On most days, the processors sort through their haul of cosmic noise, file it away, and the morning shift arrives to find nothing new. But on October 17th, something had been flagged. Not urgently, not with any alarm, just a quiet notation in the night cycle log that a signal had been recorded in the hydrogen line band, and that the signal did not match any known pattern of natural background radiation, and that the signal appeared to be repeating. The technician who first saw the notation was a 26-year-old named Marcus Webb, doing contract work while finishing his postgraduate thesis. He looked at the log. He looked at the waveform data. He pulled up the raw recording and played it through the facility's analysis software. What he saw were pulses, regular pulses, separated by carefully measured intervals. 2 pulses, then 3, then 5, then 7, then 11, then 13. The first 6 prime numbers, repeating in sequence, the gaps between each pulse corresponding precisely to the mathematical distance between primes in the sequence, over and over again, cycling through its pattern every 11 minutes and 38 seconds. Webb sat for a long time and stared at his screen. Then he did what any careful, methodical, not trying to be famous postgraduate researcher would do. He tagged the file as a potential anomaly, flagged it for peer review, wrote a brief description in the automated reporting system, and went to get coffee. The signal was archived. It was not escalated. No one, in those early hours, quite understood what they had. No one in those early hours was ready to say the words that the data was beginning to silently suggest. Orpheus Station had been operational since March 3rd, 2001. It was not the sort of satellite that made headlines. It was not a Hubble, not a James Webb, not a telescope designed to take the breathtaking deep-field photographs that universities put on posters and governments display in press conferences. Orpheus was a working instrument launched through a joint initiative between the European Space Agency's Astrophysics Division and a private aerospace contractor called Helios Dynamics, a company known primarily among industry insiders for its work in long-range telemetry systems and deep-spectrum radio monitoring. The station's orbit had been calculated to keep it stable and precisely positioned for extended observation of specific frequency bands. Its purpose was threefold: to monitor deep-spectrum cosmic radiation in wavelength ranges difficult to observe through Earth's atmosphere, to detect gamma burst signatures that might indicate high-energy astrophysical events, and to maintain continuous surveillance across radio frequencies associated with non-natural anomaly detection. That last mandate was, publicly, the least glamorous and most vaguely defined. In practice, it meant that Orpheus was, in part, listening for exactly what Webb had recorded on the ground in Australia. It was, in part, a SETI instrument. Not the primary instrument, not the instrument that the grant applications focused on, but built into its core detection mandate, quietly, was a set of parameters designed to recognize patterns that nature alone would not generate. Orpheus had been operational for nearly a decade when the signal appeared. 9 years of data, faithfully collected, faithfully transmitted to the receiving stations on the ground, faithfully analysed by algorithms, and periodically reviewed by teams at Helios Dynamics and ESA. 9 years of mostly nothing. Occasional anomalies all explained. Gamma bursts from distant supernova, pulsar rhythms, fast radio bursts, those still mysterious millisecond flashes from unimaginable distances. But nothing that required the third protocol. Nothing that triggered the non-natural anomaly detection suite in the way it was quietly designed to respond. Not until January 12th, 2010, when the signal came back, and this time it was not a faint trace flagged in an overnight log. This time, the signal was strong enough that Orpheus's automated systems locked onto it immediately, spinning the station's primary receiving array to track the source with the same reflexive precision that a sunflower tracks the arc of light across the sky. The signal was broadcasting on 1.42 GHz. The pulses were marching through their prime number sequence with mathematical precision. And when the triangulation systems passed the incoming data, establishing the source bearing through multiple reception points and calculating the angle of origin against the station's known position, the number that came back stopped the team in Helios Dynamics Monitoring Center cold. The signal was originating from beyond the Oort cloud, from the outermost frontier of the solar system, the great diffuse sphere of icy bodies and primal debris that marks the boundary between everything we have ever mapped and the vast, dark, interstellar unknown beyond. And the source, whatever was generating those pulses, whatever was broadcasting those prime numbers into the hydrogen line with such measured, deliberate regularity, was moving slowly but deliberately inward toward the sun, toward us. Dr. Soren Wahl had spent 17 years working in the field that colleagues sometimes called, with affectionate condescension, the wilderness of data analysis. The official title varied depending on which institution he was currently affiliated with, but the work was always the same, looking at large, complex data sets and finding the structures hidden inside them. Pattern recognition, statistical modelling, the art of seeing signal in noise. He was 43 years old in the winter of 2010, a compact, quiet man who had published 12 peer-reviewed papers in his career, none of which had ever made headlines, all of which were considered precise and methodologically rigorous by the small community of specialists who read them. He had a reputation for being skeptical about his own conclusions, which in his field was considered a virtue. When Val was brought in to analyse the Orpheus data in late February of 2010, it was with the explicit understanding that his job was not to find anything interesting. His job was to find the mundane explanation, the equipment malfunction, the environmental interference, the known natural phenomenon that had been temporarily miscategorized. He was the man you called when you needed someone to carefully dismantle a claim before it became embarrassing. He was, in the quiet internal culture of the project, the doubt. He received the full data archive on a Tuesday morning and began working through it systematically. By Thursday evening, he had abandoned the search for a mundane explanation and had begun, with increasing unease, to build a case for something else entirely. The prime number pulse sequence was, on its own, remarkable enough. Mathematics does not organize itself into prime number sequences by accident. Nature does not count primes. But what Val found embedded within the pulse intervals, in the gaps between the signals themselves, in the micro variations in timing that the first analysts had written off as transmission noise, was far more complex than a simple counting sequence. When he mapped the interval data against a frequency visualization algorithm he had developed for an entirely different project years earlier, a different kind of structure emerged. The gaps between pulses were not random. They were not even simply prime sequential. They contained a second layer of information, encoding harmonic ratios, mathematical relationships found throughout physics and acoustics and celestial mechanics, relationships that appeared again and again in the architecture of natural systems, from the vibrations of atomic bonds to the orbital resonances of moons and planets. And when he took those harmonic ratios and plotted them against a spatial coordinate system, when he let the mathematics describe positions in three-dimensional space and connected those positions with lines, the image that emerged made his throat tighten. It was a map, a star map, rendered in the abstract language of harmonic mathematics, using frequency ratios as coordinates in a spatial system that pointed to specific positions in the sky. Val checked it against every known astronomical catalogue. He ran it through stellar position databases, against constellations, against the mapped locations of pulsars and quasars and gamma ray sources. The stars it pointed to did not appear in any of them. It was a map of stars that, as far as any record showed, had never been catalogued. As far as any record showed, perhaps did not exist in any direction from Earth that human telescopes had yet surveyed. He sat in his office for a long time after that. He thought about professional reputation. He thought about the particular loneliness of being the person who reports something that cannot be explained. He thought about the 17 years he had spent carefully, methodically disproving things. And then he wrote his preliminary report, and he used the word unprecedented 3 times in the executive summary, and he sent it to the Helios Dynamics Oversight Committee with a note recommending immediate escalation. There was something else in the data, something that even Val had not, at first, recognised for what it was. It appeared every 9th transmission cycle, a burst of broadband noise that stood out from the clean, precise prime number pulses, like static from a broken radio. The initial analysis had written it off as interference, a compression artifact perhaps, or some form of electromagnetic contamination from the station's own systems. It lasted exactly 0.4 seconds. It contained, as far as the standard analysis software was concerned, no coherent information. But Val had a habit, born of 17 years of staring at anomalies, of not trusting standard analysis software's definition of no coherent information. He isolated one of the broadband bursts and began processing it manually, running it through every decompression and deconvolution algorithm at his disposal. He slowed it down. He slowed it down further. He mapped its frequency components against two-dimensional space and let the visualization software render whatever structure might be hiding inside. What appeared on his screen, when the processing was finally complete, was an image. Faint, partial, constructed from what appeared to be a form of frequency domain encoding that had no exact equivalent in any human communications protocol he had ever studied, but unmistakably an image, unmistakably structured, intentional, designed to convey visual information. The shapes in the image were geometric, but not in the way that crystalline structures or fractal natural patterns are geometric. They were architectural. They suggested depth and scale and design intent. There were interlocking ring structures, massive in apparent dimension, their surfaces textured with repeating patterns that suggested manufactured precision. There were what might have been entranceways or junctions or ports, openings where one structure met another in configurations that followed spatial logic but defied any familiar architectural grammar. The angles were wrong, not randomly wrong, not chaotically wrong, but systematically wrong in the way that certain mathematical objects are wrong, correct according to rules, just not rules that human geometry uses. Non-Euclidean, Val wrote in his notes. The phrase felt inadequate. He stared at the image for a very long time, and then he copied the file to an encrypted drive, and then he attached it to his escalation report as evidence, and then he sat quietly for several minutes and tried to manage a particular kind of feeling that he was not accustomed to, the feeling of having found exactly what he had been sent to disprove. On April 2nd, 2010, at 4:17 in the morning Universal Coordinated Time, the monitoring systems at the Helios Dynamics ground control facility began registering something that their operators had never seen before and had not designed their systems to handle. Orpheus Station was firing its maneuvering thrusters. This was not unusual in itself. The station performed routine orbital maintenance burns on a scheduled basis, and the operators were accustomed to watching the telemetry data fluctuate slightly as the station adjusted its position. What was unusual was that no one had commanded it. No scheduled burn appeared in the mission calendar. No operator had issued a command. No pre-programmed maintenance routine matched the timing or the thrust vector of what the station was doing. Orpheus was repositioning itself autonomously, and the repositioning was not arbitrary. The thrust calculations, when the operations team ran them through their trajectory software, showed that the station was rotating to orient its primary imaging and receiving arrays in a single specific direction, toward the signal source, toward the object in the outer solar system. The reorientation took 47 minutes to complete, burning fuel that had not been allocated for this purpose, following a precise sequence of thruster commands that the engineers could reconstruct after the fact, but could not find the origin of in any of the station's programming architecture. When the full maneuver log was pulled and analysed, it was clear that the command sequence had not come from the ground. It had not been generated by any of the station's known autonomous routines. The telemetry log, updated in real time as the maneuver completed, showed a single line of system text that no one had ever seen before, printed in the same format as any other automated status update. Matter of fact and precise. Signal proximity override engaged. The chief systems engineer at Helios Dynamics, a 15-year veteran named Petra Holst, looked at that line for a long time before she quietly pulled the three most senior members of her team into a closed-door meeting and told them that there appeared to be a protocol running inside Orpheus Station's operating system that none of them had written, that none of them had ever seen. That appeared to have been dormant, waiting for 9 years, and that had activated the moment the signal reached sufficient strength. On May 28, 2010, Orpheus acquired its first visual imagery of the object. The data packet arrived at the ground station in the small hours of the morning and was processed by the automated imaging pipeline, which assembled the raw sensor data into a visual representation and flagged it for human review according to the standard anomaly protocol. The technician on duty, a young woman who had been working the night shift for 3 months and had developed the particular hollow-eyed equanimity of someone whose job consists largely of looking at nothing, stared at her screen for a full minute before she reached for the telephone and called the senior duty officer. The senior duty officer called Holst. Holst called Val. By the time the sun rose over the facility, there were 7 people in the imaging lab, and none of them were speaking. The object in the photographs was vast. The preliminary size estimates based on angular diameter measurements against the known distance calculations suggested a length of approximately 18 kilometers. 18 kilometers. Not 18 meters. Not 1800 meters. 18 kilometers of structure, tumbling slowly through the outer solar system on its long, deliberate inward trajectory. The shape was roughly cylindrical, but asymmetrical in ways that confounded the eye, proportioned differently on each end, tapering and widening in patterns that suggested not random geological formation, but designed differentiation, as if each section had a specific structural purpose that required its particular dimensions. The surface of the object was unlike anything in any reference database. It had the quality of a liquid held in a fixed state, reflective and flowing in texture, catching the distant light of the sun and returning it in patterns that shifted as the object rotated. The rotation itself was steady and unhurried, but there was no visible mechanism for it. No jets, no outgassing plumes, no evidence of the kind of torque that normally maintains the spin of a natural body. It was rotating in the way that a gyroscope rotates, with a precision that implied maintenance, not mere momentum. The object was designated Anomalous Object 201007 in the official records. But among the small team who had clearance to know it existed, it quickly acquired a different name, taken from the signal that had announced its approach, from the station that had found it, from the particular quality of its silence. They called it the Orpheus Object, as if the station had, somehow, always been waiting to discover it, as if the mission had, from the beginning, been oriented toward this specific encounter, this specific revelation, this specific and terrible arrival of something that had chosen this moment. After decades of human radio telescope listening, after decades of pointing antennas at the hydrogen line and hearing nothing to make itself known, the electromagnetic analysis team worked through the imagery and the concurrent sensor data over the following weeks and produced a report that Val later described in a private communication that was never meant for wider circulation. as the most frightening document he had ever read. The object was not passive. It was radiating across multiple spectrums in ways that implied active internal processes. The gamma radiation output was low, below any threshold that would represent a direct hazard to nearby spacecraft, below the levels that would trigger automated safety alerts in the monitoring systems. But it was present, and it was measurable, and it was not consistent with any naturally occurring process that the physics team could model. The neutrino output was more remarkable still. Neutrinos are among the most elusive particles in physics. They pass through ordinary matter almost entirely without interaction, and detecting them requires massive, specialized instruments buried deep underground to eliminate interference from other particle types. The standard sensor suite on Orpheus was not equipped to detect them with high precision, but the flux was significant enough to register even against the background noise. And the neutrino bursts were artificial. They were structured. They were synchronized. And this was the detail that made the physicists in the room go very quiet. They were synchronized precisely with the prime number pulse sequence that the signal had been broadcasting from the beginning. Every time the electromagnetic signal pulsed, the neutrino output spiked in exact correspondence. The signal and the neutrinos were parts of the same system, broadcasting together, locked in the same rhythm. And when the analysis team stepped back from the individual measurements and looked at the whole picture, the electromagnetic pulses, the neutrino bursts, the object's trajectory, its speed, its steady inward movement, the conclusion that the physics demanded was not a comfortable one. The signal was not communication. It had never been communication. The prime numbers were not a greeting, not a message, not an attempt to establish contact with whatever civilization might be listening on the hydrogen line. The signal was navigational. It was telemetry. It was the same category of emission that a vessel transmits when it is moving through space and needs to broadcast its position and velocity to a receiving station. The Orpheus object was not calling out to the cosmos at large. It was reporting to someone specific. It was transmitting its own coordinates. And somewhere, across whatever distance separated this solar system from its origin point, something was receiving those coordinates. Something knew exactly where it was going. The trajectory calculations were completed and verified over 3 separate rounds of independent analysis through the summer of 2010, and the result was consistent each time. At its current velocity and heading, anomalous object 201, 007 would pass within the orbit of Mars sometime in the year 2014. The speed was not fast by the standards of human-launched spacecraft. The object was moving at a fraction of the velocity that a ballistic trajectory would produce, far slower than the natural drift of most cometary bodies, something between a deliberate crawl and a measured approach. It was not drifting. Every observation confirmed this with increasing precision. The object's heading showed micro-corrections over time, tiny adjustments to its trajectory that kept it on a path that was far too specific to be orbital mechanics. Nature does not produce trajectories with course corrections. Physics does not reach out and nudge an 18-kilometer object 2 degrees to the left because the current heading is slightly off. The object was steering. And when the political implications of that word, steering, worked their way through the chain of communication from the science team to the institutional leadership, to whatever quiet liaison arrangements existed between the civilian space agencies and the classified national security infrastructure, the response was rapid and opaque, and happened largely in rooms that did not appear on any official calendar. International coordination among the major space agencies took place through back channels that had been established during the Cold War for exactly this kind of eventuality. Channels that most of the working scientists at those agencies did not know existed. The American space defense infrastructure deployed a suite of orbital surveillance assets whose specifications did not appear in any publicly accessible database. The Russian military reactivated a network of deep space radar installations that had been mothballed since the 1990s, capable of tracking objects at extreme distances with far greater resolution than civilian astronomy instruments. China began routing data from its lunar relay infrastructure through a classified analysis pipeline, building a continuous tracking capability that would allow it to monitor the object's movement with global coordination. None of this was announced. None of it was publicly acknowledged. In the open scientific literature, in the journals and conference proceedings and press releases that constitute the visible surface of institutional astronomy, the Orpheus object did not exist. The signal that Marcus Webb had flagged on that October morning remained an archived anomaly, buried under 9 months of routine data, invisible unless you knew precisely where to look. The world went about its business. People commuted and cooked dinner and argued about politics and watched the same sky that had always been there, never knowing that somewhere in the long dark beyond Pluto, something 18 kilometers long was making its steady, purposeful, course-corrected approach. The last full data transmission from Orpheus Station arrived at the Helios Dynamics ground facility at 9:42 in the morning on August 11th, 2010. The packet was flagged immediately upon receipt, not by any human analyst, but by the automated processing system that had been programmed in the weeks following the April repositioning event to prioritize any imagery or sensor data from the station's primary array. What the packet contained was imagery, close-range imagery captured at a distance that the telemetry data suggested was no greater than several hundred kilometers, extraordinarily close for a monitoring station not designed for proximity operations. The imaging resolution was accordingly extraordinary. The surface of the object filled every frame, and the surface was not what the earlier long-range images had suggested. The liquid metallic quality of the object's exterior was still present, but at close range it resolved into something far more structured. The surface was covered in patterns. Not patterns in the sense of the geometric regularity that might appear in crystal lattice structures or mineral formations. These were moving patterns, dynamic. The texture of the surface was shifting in ways that the image analysis team would later describe, in their careful technical language, as exhibiting organized motion consistent with deliberate expression, which was their way of saying, without quite saying, that the surface of the Orpheus object appeared to be writing. The glyphs, the analysts settled on that word after rejecting symbol and marking and character as insufficiently precise, moved across the surface in flows and eddies, clustering and dispersing, combining and separating, cycling through arrangements that suggested a vocabulary without ever quite resolving into the static legibility that human writing systems have. They covered every visible centimetre of the hull. They moved with purpose, and in the final frame of the data packet, captured in the last second before the transmission ended, the image enhancement algorithms later resolved a detail that no one who worked on the analysis ever quite recovered from. In one area of the surface, the glyphs had organised themselves into a configuration that was different from the rest. Denser, more static, more deliberate in its stillness, amid all the surrounding motion. And within that configuration, there was a shape that was not a glyph, a shape that was recognizable to any human eye with complete and immediate certainty. After that final frame, Orpheus Station transmitted nothing more. Every system on board, power, telemetry, attitude control, communications, the scientific instruments, the very operating system that had been running continuously for 9 years, went silent simultaneously. Not sequentially, not in the cascade failure pattern of a power outage or a hardware malfunction where systems go down one by one as their dependencies fail. All at once. The engineering team at Helios Dynamics spent weeks trying to identify a mechanism that could explain a simultaneous total failure of redundant systems on a functional station in a stable orbit. They never found one. The station was not damaged. It was not struck by debris. It was not experiencing a power failure. Every diagnostic they could run from the ground suggested that Orpheus Station was structurally intact, its hardware uncompromised. It simply was not responding. It was as if something had reached inside the station's electronic nervous system and switched everything off. One by one, no, all at once, as if the station had served its purpose. As if whatever had commanded it to reorient, whatever dormant protocol had awakened in April and directed the station's attention toward the approaching object, had now, having received what it needed, quietly and efficiently shut the whole thing down. The last line in the station's telemetry log, printed in the same matter-of-fact system font as every other automated status update, was the same line that had appeared in April. Structure is responding to observation, then nothing. The program that would later be known among the small community of cleared personnel as Project Silent Reach was initiated through an emergency authorization process in the spring of 2011, moving from initial proposal to hardware integration in a time frame that the engineers involved described, privately, as the most intense work of their careers. The probe, officially designated a deep space reconnaissance instrument under a classification level that most of the engineers working on it did not themselves possess, was launched from a facility whose public designation was a commercial satellite testing site. It carried no crew, obviously. It carried the most sophisticated sensor suite that could be assembled, integrated, and shielded within the physical envelope of a probe sized for the launch vehicle available. It carried a sample collection system, though the collection protocols were designed for a situation in which the object in question was inert and passive, a design assumption that the mission planners had included for procedural reasons, understanding that it was probably irrelevant. It carried cameras. It carried the full spectrum of radiation detectors, spectrographic analyzers, magnetic field sensors, and gravitational measurement instruments that represented the state-of-the-art in unmanned deep space reconnaissance. And it carried, in a shielded compartment whose purpose was not documented in any of the engineering specs accessible to the launch facility personnel, a series of extremely precise and high-resolution imaging systems calibrated specifically to the visual characteristics of anomalous object 201007. The probe took the better part of a year to close the distance to the object. During that approach, the tracking stations continued to monitor the object's progress and the probe's trajectory, adjusting the intercept calculation as new positional data refined the picture. The probe performed as designed. Its systems functioned nominally, and when it finally reached visual acquisition range, when the first images began transmitting back to the receiving stations, showing the object in the probe's cameras at resolutions orders of magnitude better than anything Orpheus had captured. The mission controllers in the monitoring facility watched the feed in a silence that was, by every account later given, total. The feed opened on the object's surface at medium range, showing the broad cylindrical bulk of it against the darkness, the liquid metallic texture faintly luminescent in the probe's active illumination systems. As the probe continued its approach, the surface began to change. Not the glyph motion that Orpheus had documented, something different. Openings, apertures, sections of the object's hull that had, in every prior observation, appeared seamlessly continuous were now separating, sliding apart along lines that had been invisible at distance. The openings were not random. They formed in direct proportion to the probe's approach vector, as if the object were tracking the probe's position in real time and adjusting its response accordingly, as if it were opening, as if it were inviting inspection. The probe's cameras showed interior spaces illuminated by a deep, rhythmic pulsation of blue-white light, not a steady glow, but a breathing luminescence that expanded and contracted in intervals that the analysts would later identify as corresponding to the prime number sequence. Everything about this object corresponded to the prime number sequence. The internal chambers were vast, their dimensions suggesting interior volumes far larger than simple exterior geometry should have accommodated. The structures visible within them were complex and purposeful and utterly alien. And then, at approximately 43 minutes into the approach phase, the probe's signal began to change. Not fail, not degrade in the way that hardware malfunction produces. The random degradation, the growing static, the loss of signal lock that equipment failure generates. Change. The probe's instruments were still functioning. The transmission was still being received. But what was being transmitted was no longer the probe's own data. The signal coming back from the probe was the prime number pulse sequence, identical to the original signal that Marcus Webb had flagged in the Western Australia facility, identical in frequency, in pulse structure, in the harmonic encoding that Val had spent months decrypting. The probe was transmitting the Orpheus object's signal. Its own communication systems had been overwritten, whatever the object had done in those 43 minutes of approach. Whatever had passed through the vacuum between the probe's hull and the object's surface, whatever handshake or assimilation or colonization of electronic systems had occurred, the probe was no longer the probe. The feed cut, not at the transmission end. The probe was still there, still functioning, still transmitting. The feed cut at the receiving end, because the engineers at the monitoring facility, watching the probe's telemetry transform in real time into something that was not their telemetry, made the decision to close the connection. They did not consult with their leadership before doing so. There are some feeds you close by instinct. Val did not stop working after the probe mission ended. He could not stop. The data he had accumulated over 2 years of analysis had a weight and a momentum that could not simply be set down. Not when the questions it raised were unanswered, not when the implications it suggested were too large to ignore and too strange to accept. He continued working with the archived signal data, running it through new analytical frameworks, approaching it from angles that the initial analysis teams had not tried. What he found over the following months changed the shape of everything. The signal contained more than he had initially understood. The prime number sequence and the harmonic star map were real, and his earlier analysis of them was accurate. But they were not the full content of the transmission. They were, in a sense, the address on the envelope. Buried within the same transmission data, in layers that required a different approach to see, were temporal markers, mathematical constructs that encoded specific moments in time using the positions of stars as reference points. Not the stars on Thal's mysterious map, the stars whose positions matched no known catalogue. Known stars. Stars whose positions in the sky had been recorded and catalogued and calculated forward and backward in time by human astronomers for centuries. The temporal markers, when Thal decoded them, corresponded to specific dates. Dates spread across a span of what his calculation suggested was several thousand years of human history. Interspersed with the temporal markers were planetary mass references, precise numerical values encoding the physical characteristics of bodies in the solar system with a specificity that went well beyond what any casual or observational survey would produce, and threaded through all of it, appearing repeatedly across every layer of the signal that Thal analysed, were stellar life cycle data, detailed information about the evolutionary stages of stars, about the expected lifespans of main sequence stars in different mass ranges, about the timescales across which habitable zones around stars remain viable. He wrote the conclusion in his private journal on a night in late 2012, sitting alone in his office with the data spread across 3 monitors. The object was not exploring, it was not communicating, it was not making contact in the way that decades of SETI research had imagined contact might occur. One civilization reaching out to another across the void, 2 minds encountering each other in the darkness and finding something to say. The object was surveying, systematically, methodically, with the comprehensive precision of an instrument built for a specific institutional purpose, built to collect specific categories of information about specific types of locations and report that information back to whoever had deployed it. The temporal markers mapped its itinerary. The planetary mass references were its measurements. The stellar life cycle data was its evaluation criteria. The Orpheus object was cataloguing star systems, assessing them against a standardized set of criteria, recording their properties and calculating their viability across timescales that made human civilization look like an afternoon. And this solar system, with its particular arrangement of planets, its particular star, its particular distance from the galactic centre, had apparently measured favourably against whatever standards were being applied. The thermal imaging data that the probe had captured in its 43 minutes of approach, before the feed was cut, contained a discovery that the initial post-mission analysis had not fully processed. The imaging resolution was high enough, and the object's internal chambers were sufficiently illuminated by that pulsing blue light to support detailed structural analysis of what was inside. The analysis team had focused initially on the macro architecture, the vast interior spaces, the connecting structures, the unfamiliar geometries of the object's engineering. They had been looking at scale. They had not at first been looking at the individual units. When Thal returned to the thermal imaging data and began processing it at maximum resolution, what he saw in the interior chambers was a series of enclosed modules, regular in spacing, regular in size, arranged in the kind of dense, systematic array that suggested maximum use of available space, the packing logic of storage or transport, not the open layout of a vessel built for habitation or work. Each module registered a distinct thermal signature, warm at its centre, and within that warmth, when the resolution was pushed to its absolute limit, and the image enhancement algorithms did everything they could with the available data, there were shapes, organic shapes, curved and bilateral and unmistakably biological in their proportions. Each module contained a silhouette, and the silhouette, rendered in the faint thermal glow of whatever medium surrounded it, had a shape that no analyst in the room could look at without feeling the specific and overwhelming recognition that comes from seeing something familiar in a place where familiarity is the most terrifying possible discovery. The shape was human scale. It was human proportioned. It was, in its bilateral symmetry and its particular arrangement of mass, its particular suggestion of enclosed, suspended form, as human in outline as anything the analysts had ever seen in a medical imaging database. The chambers were not mechanical. They were not cargo bays, not fuel cells, not the kind of functional architectural space that the object's survey mission would require. They were pods, and each pod contained something that looked, in the limited resolution of a thermal image captured from a probe that was subsequently assimilated and its feed cut like a body, on a date that would later be established as sometime in the early months of 2013. The tracking network monitoring anomalous object 2.01007 registered a change in its trajectory. The change was small, measured in fractions of degrees of orbital deflection. It would not have been visible without the precision monitoring infrastructure that the International Classified Network had assembled. But it was real, it was measurable, and when the trajectory calculation was updated to incorporate the new heading, the result produced in the monitoring facilities a response that had not been seen in those rooms before. Complete silence, lasting several minutes, as the analysts and their supervisors stared at the projected flight path and processed what they were seeing. The new trajectory, if maintained, would bring the object across Earth's orbital path at some point in the future. The calculation was refined over the following weeks as more positional data accumulated, and the date window that emerged was 2027. Not 2014, the earlier projection, not a pass inside Mars' orbit and then out again, exiting the solar system or settling into a stable, eccentric orbit. Earth's orbital path, Earth's orbital window, 2027. The contingency planning that followed was meticulous and entirely classified and had no public component. The people in the rooms where these plans were made were not, by and large, people who showed their fear. They were trained to present analysis and options and recommendations. But the analysis was what it was. The options were limited, and the recommendations, when they were made, carried a weight that the standard language of institutional planning was not quite built to hold. The corrupted backup drive from Orpheus Station was recovered as part of a routine decommissioning process applied to legacy storage infrastructure in the Helios Dynamics Data Archive in 2019. 9 years had passed since the station had gone dark. The drive had sat in the archive for all of those years, flagged as corrupted and unreadable, never formally discarded because the decommissioning protocols required formal sign-off that had not been obtained. The data recovery effort was not initially treated as a priority. The drive had been written off years earlier, and the expectation was that whatever it had contained was irretrievable. But the technician who was inventorying the archive flagged it to the senior archivist, who was one of the few people in the Helios Dynamics organization who still carried the classification clearance from the Orpheus project. The senior archivist called Petra Holst. Holst, now retired from her engineering role, but still reachable, called Val. The data recovery process took 6 weeks and required tools that had to be specifically developed for the corruption patterns on the drive, which did not match any standard data degradation profile that the recovery specialists had encountered before. The corruption was, in the judgment of the specialists who worked on it, structured, not random noise, not the chaotic pattern of hardware failure or magnetic degradation. Structured corruption, as if the data had been selectively and precisely modified at the bit level in a pattern designed to prevent standard recovery methods from succeeding. The specialist described it as something they had never seen before. The recovered data was partial, fragments, but among those fragments was a single video file, the last visual recording Orpheus Station had made before going dark. The file was enhanced frame by frame using the best image processing tools available in 2019, technology that had not existed in 2010. The enhancement process took several days, and at the end of it, there was one frame that the analysis had partially reconstructed from the corrupted data, a single moment from Orpheus Station's last recording, the last image the station's cameras had captured before everything went silent. The image showed the surface of the Orpheus object. But in one section of the hull, the liquid metallic surface had formed a reflective area, a region where the surface had achieved a mirror-like quality, catching and returning the light that fell on it. And in that reflection, distorted by the curvature of the surface but reconstructible through the enhancement algorithms, was an image, not the station, not space, not the star field that the station would have had in its camera's background. The reflection showed a planet, a world seen from space, wrapped in cloud and shadow, and the particular blue luminosity of a world that has oceans. Recognizable to any person who had ever looked at a photograph taken from orbit as unmistakably familiar. Earth, but not Earth as any photograph had ever shown it. Not the pale blue dot of Voyager's famous image. Not the full globe Apollo photographs. Not the sharp detailed composites assembled from modern satellite imagery. The Earth in the reflection was different. Its surface was covered. Its continents were marked not by the natural patterns of geography and vegetation and city light that human satellites mapped, but by structures. Vast structures, visible from orbit, covering landmass after landmass with patterns of architecture so enormous and so dense that from space they read as texture, as surface modification, as the total transformation of a natural world into something built. Not a future imagined by human science fiction, not the gleaming cities of optimistic extrapolation. Something else, something that had the organized, comprehensive, total quality of a construction project nearing completion. Something that suggested that whatever was coming in 2027 had not selected this world arbitrarily, had not found it in a database of unvisited star systems and chosen it fresh. Something that suggested the ending had already been written. The signal that Val had been decoding, layer by layer, for years had one final component that he had been working on since the probe mission. A translation, not a human translation of alien language. The content of the signal was mathematical, not linguistic, and the mathematics encoded specific information rather than open meaning, but a summary, a statement, a record of what the survey had found and what had been decided in response. The final decoded output of the transmission that had been broadcasting on 1.42 GHz since before Marcus Webb arrived at his console on that October morning ran to 12 words when rendered in English. 12 words that had been travelling through the hydrogen line for years, past Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, past the Oort cloud boundary, into the interstellar medium, and presumably to whoever or whatever had sent the Orpheus object on its long journey in the first place. Survey complete. Habitat viability confirmed. Return cycle initiated. The object had never been a probe in the sense that human engineers meant when they used the word probe. It was not an exploratory instrument sent to gather data on an unknown destination. It was a census vessel, a machine built to visit worlds that had already been identified as candidates, to take the measurements that the census required, to confirm the evaluations that had already been made. The star map embedded in the signal, the stars that matched no catalogue, the positions that pointed to no constellation visible from Earth, was not a map of where the signal was coming from. It was a map of other worlds, other candidates, other entries in a ledger of viable habitats being compiled by an intelligence that moved on timescales that made the entirety of human history a single data point. The pods were not cargo. Whatever was in them had not been placed there during the current survey run. Whatever organic forms the thermal imaging had caught in its limited resolution, glimpses of the interior chambers were not specimens collected during the approach to this solar system, not samples taken during the decades of this particular survey mission. The pods were old, the object was old. It had been making its slow, course-corrected way through the darkness for a very long time before it reached the outer boundary of this solar system, before it began broadcasting its navigational telemetry on the hydrogen line, before the first dish in Western Australia caught the edge of its signal, and a young postgraduate researcher flagged an anomaly in the overnight log. What was in the pods had been there for a very long time, long enough that the temporal markers in the signal, those mathematical timestamps referencing known stellar positions at specific moments in history, corresponded not just to recent history, not just to the era of radio telescopes and space agencies and classified programs. The timestamps corresponded to ancient history, thousands of years of ancient history, civilizations that had no radio telescopes, civilizations that looked at the same night sky and saw in it the faces of gods, civilizations that built monuments of such astronomical precision that their alignment with specific stars has never been fully explained by any model that relies solely on natural human observation and simple tools. The ship had been here before, not on this approach, before, long before, and in those earlier visitations recorded in the temporal markers of a signal that had been broadcasting its navigational telemetry long before anyone on Earth was capable of receiving it. The survey had been ongoing. The data had been collected. The assessments had been made. The organic silhouettes in the pod's bilateral human scale, suspended in whatever medium the thermal imaging had detected, had perhaps been there since those earlier visits. Were perhaps the product of those earlier visits. Were perhaps the reason that the encoded stellar life cycle data emphasized viable timescales for habitation rather than simply geological or atmospheric conditions. The capability for sustained habitation. The capacity for the kind of long-term occupation that would make a world worth returning to. Survey complete was not a recent conclusion. It was a final entry in a record that had been accumulating across millennia. Habitat viability confirmed had been tested and retested through repeated observation, repeated contact, the long patient accumulation of data across multiple generations of the civilization that was being evaluated. Return cycle initiated was the phrase that had no reassuring interpretation, none at all, regardless of how long one spent examining it. It was the phrase that Val read in his decoded output at 2 a.m, alone in his office with the reconstructed image of a transformed Earth still glowing on one of his monitors, and it was the phrase that he spent several hours simply sitting with, not writing, not analysing, not reaching for any of the methodological tools that 17 years of careful scientific work had given him. Just sitting with the weight of it, the specific and terrible completeness of it, the way those 4 words return cycle initiated, closed a loop that had been open for thousands of years and suggested with the calm authority of a mathematical conclusion that whatever was coming in 2027 was not arriving to survey. It was arriving to stay. The hydrogen line is still broadcasting. The dishes are still listening. Somewhere in the archive of that Western Australian facility, buried under years of data, there is a flagged anomaly from an October morning in 2009, tagged by a 26-year-old postgraduate researcher who went to get coffee afterward and filed it away and continued working on his thesis. Somewhere in the classified systems of multiple national security infrastructures, there are trajectory calculations and contingency plans and a file number that corresponds to an object that has never appeared in any public scientific database. Somewhere between here and the inner edge of the asteroid belt, an 18-kilometre object continues its slow, deliberate, course-corrected approach. The signal is still broadcasting. The hydrogen line is still being monitored. And the universe, vast and dark and patient, continues its long conversation with itself. Whether anyone on this particular world was ever meant to hear it, or whether hearing it was always part of the plan, is a question that the decoded signal, in its 12-word summary of centuries of deliberate work, does not address. It does not need to. The survey is complete. The cycle has begun. There are exactly 423 words in the official closure notice for Section 12 of White Pine National Forest. I have read them so many times I can recite them from memory. The document, filed with the Department of Interior on March 14th, lists the reason for closure as ongoing environmental study requiring restricted access for public safety. The closure affects approximately 8 square miles of old-growth forest in northern Idaho, a section of wilderness I have visited every autumn for the past 11 years. The notice does not specify what is being studied. It does not provide a timeline for reopening. It does not mention any ecological disaster, fire risk, or wildlife concern. The language is so deliberately vague that it feels like a form someone filled out while trying very hard not to say anything at all. When I called the ranger station, the woman who answered told me she couldn't provide additional details. When I asked who could, she said she didn't know. When I asked if anyone knew, there was a long pause before she suggested I submit a written request through the regional office. She sounded tired. She sounded like she had answered this question many times already. I am not a conspiracy theorist. I work as an accountant. I file taxes. I arrive at conclusions based on documentation and verifiable information. But I also know when something does not add up. A forest does not simply close without explanation. Not one that has been accessible to the public for over 70 years. Not one with maintained trails and seasonal campsites and a parking lot that gets repaved every other summer. So on a cold Saturday in late October, I parked at the closed gate on Forest Road 18 and started walking. The chain across the road was new. The signs were new. Everything else looked exactly as it always had, which made what I found 3 hours later so much worse, because the forest had not changed. The forest had rearranged itself, and it had done so in ways that should have been impossible. My boots crunched on gravel as I ducked under the chain. The temperature was dropping as afternoon shadows lengthened across the access road. I had brought proper gear: water, emergency supplies, a first aid kit, navigation equipment. I had told no one where I was going. That was probably stupid. But I also did not want to explain why I was trespassing in a closed federal wilderness area because a bureaucratic form letter had failed to satisfy my curiosity. The first mile of the approach road was exactly as I remembered it. Packed dirt surface with scattered gravel, slight upward grade, Douglas firs pressing close on both sides, their lower branches dead and grey from lack of sunlight. The forest floor was the typical northwestern composition: thick moss covering fallen logs, sword ferns clustered in damp hollows, the occasional devil's club with its spiky stems warning hikers to keep their distance. Everything was normal. Everything was familiar. That was what made the shift so disorienting when it finally happened. Chapter 1. A familiar place that feels off. I have walked the Ridgeline Trail 47 times. I know its turns. I know where the incline sharpens near mile marker 2. I know the cluster of white birch trees that grows just before the trail splits toward Crescent Lake. I know the flat boulder shaped like a broken tooth that marks the halfway point. I know this trail the way you know the route to your own mailbox, which is why I noticed immediately when things were wrong. The trailhead started in the right place. The wooden sign marking the route was exactly where it should be, weathered and familiar. The carved letters spelling Ridgeline Trail were worn but legible. The arrow pointing into the forest was correct. But within 20 minutes of hiking, I realised the distances were off. The birch cluster appeared too early. The incline came too late. The boulder was present, but it was on the wrong side of the path. I stopped and checked my phone. No signal, which was normal this far in, but my downloaded GPS map showed my position clearly. I was on the Ridgeline Trail. My coordinates matched perfectly with the trail route I had hiked dozens of times before. According to the satellite data, I was exactly where I should be. But the landscape around me did not match my memory. I have read about missing time in abduction accounts. I have read about spatial disorientation caused by panic or dehydration. But I was neither panicked nor dehydrated. My watch showed the correct time. My water bottle was still half full. My memory was clear. The forest was wrong. I continued walking, paying closer attention now. The trees were the same species: Douglas fir, western red cedar, lodgepole pine. The undergrowth was consistent with the region: salal, Oregon grape, sword fern. The soil was the same volcanic composition. Every individual element was correct, but their arrangement had shifted in ways that were subtle and pervasive. It reminded me of when you rearrange furniture in a room you've lived in for years. Everything is familiar. Nothing is where it used to be, except this was a forest that had stood for centuries, a forest where the positions of trees do not change. The air felt different too, heavier somehow, like the atmospheric pressure had increased slightly, or like I was breathing in a room where too many people had been talking for too long. The oxygen content was fine. I was not lightheaded or struggling, but something about the air itself felt saturated, dense with something I could not identify. Near what should have been mile marker 3, I found the first marking. It was grown into the bark of a large cedar tree, perhaps 200 years old based on its diameter. The pattern was not carved. There were no tool marks, no exposed wood, no signs of human interference. Instead, the bark itself had grown in a spiral formation that created a distinct shape. The ridges and valleys of the bark tissue had organised themselves into something that looked deliberate. The shape was the letter M. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. Bark patterns can be irregular. Wind and weather create stress that affects growth. I knew this, but this was too clean, too geometric. The spiral was too uniform, and when I stepped back to view the tree from a wider angle, I saw that the pattern was only visible from a specific position on the trail. From any other angle, it disappeared into the natural texture of the bark. Someone would have had to plan this decades ago, guiding the tree's growth with intention. But there was no mechanism for that. No wires or constraints in the bark. No evidence of long-term interference. I reached out and touched the formation. The bark was cool under my fingers, rough, completely natural in texture. The ridges where the letter formed were simply places where the bark had grown more aggressively. The valleys were places where growth had been suppressed or inhibited somehow. But by what mechanism? What could cause a tree to grow in alphabetic patterns? I took a photograph and kept walking. My hands were shaking slightly as I lowered my phone. Not from fear exactly, more from the recognition that I had encountered something that did not fit into my understanding of how the world worked, and that recognition was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. The next tree showed the letter A, then R, then C, then U. My name is Marcus. The fifth tree, bearing the letter S, was the largest of the group, an ancient cedar with a trunk diameter that would have required 3 people holding hands to encircle. The bark letter was proportionally larger here, perhaps 10 inches tall instead of 8. The spiral formation was more elaborate, with secondary patterns radiating outward from the main letter like decorative flourishes. I photographed each tree carefully, documenting the exact position, the size of the letters, the species of tree, the approximate age based on trunk diameter. I was building evidence. For what purpose, I did not yet know, but my training as an accountant had taught me that documentation was crucial, that patterns only revealed themselves through careful record keeping. The trees were spaced at intervals that felt regular. I paced out the distances, approximately 90 feet between each one. Not exact, but close enough to suggest intention rather than coincidence. Someone or something had planned this sequence, had arranged for these specific trees to grow these specific patterns at these specific locations. But when? The bark formations were not new. They had clearly been developing for years, possibly decades. I had hiked past these exact trees multiple times in previous years. I would have noticed my own name carved into them, unless I had not been looking for it, unless it had only recently become visible, or unless my memory was unreliable in ways I had not considered. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my photo archive. I had hundreds of pictures from previous hikes on this trail. I found images from last autumn, then from 2 years ago, then from 3 years ago. I zoomed in on trees in the background, looking for any sign of the bark formations. They were not there. In photographs from 3 years ago, the same trees were visible, but the bark patterns were absent, or at least not prominent enough to be visible in the image resolution I had captured, which meant either the formations had developed very recently, or they had existed but been too subtle to photograph unintentionally. I continued along the trail, watching for more letters. For the next half-mile, I found nothing unusual. The forest returned to its normal, familiar wrongness. Trees in slightly incorrect positions, curves in the trail that felt a few degrees off, but no more letters. The silence was becoming noticeable. I had not heard a bird call in at least 15 minutes. No rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. No distant sounds of aircraft or traffic. Just the crunch of my boots on the trail and my own breathing. The forest had gone completely quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Then I reached the place where Crescent Lake should have been visible through the trees. The lake was not there. I do not mean it had dried up or been drained. I mean the terrain was wrong. Where the trail should have descended toward the shoreline, it instead continued into dense forest. No break in the canopy, no glimpse of water, no sound of lapping waves, just more trees. I checked my GPS again. According to the coordinates, I was standing at the overlook point, where the trail offered a clear view of the lake. The map showed water. The elevation data showed a descent toward a body of water approximately 200 feet in diameter. But my eyes showed only forest continuing in every direction. I stood there trying to make sense of it, wondering if I had somehow taken a wrong turn despite following a clearly marked trail. Wondering if the GPS data was corrupted. Wondering if I was experiencing some kind of neurological event that was distorting my perception. The rational explanations were thin. I had followed the trail markers carefully. My GPS showed perfect satellite lock. I felt fine physically, alert, focused. No signs of confusion or disorientation beyond the obvious fact that the landscape did not match my expectations, which left increasingly irrational explanations. The forest had changed, the lake had been removed or relocated. The physical geography had been altered in ways that should have required massive earth-moving equipment and years of work, and yet there was no evidence of disturbance, no clear-cut areas, no construction scars, just pristine wilderness that was definitively not what it was supposed to be. Then I heard the sound. Chapter 3. Sound without source. It started as a low hum, barely perceptible, the kind of sound you feel in your chest more than hear with your ears. I have experienced this before near high-voltage power lines or large transformers, but there was no infrastructure here. No power lines, no roads, just wilderness. The hum lasted perhaps 10 seconds, then faded. In its place came something else. Voices, human voices speaking at a distance, at too far away to make out words, but close enough to recognize the rhythm of speech, the cadence of conversation. I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" My voice sounded flat in the dense air. No echo, no response. The distant voices continued, unaffected by my shout. I have spent enough time alone in wilderness to know how sound behaves in forests. Dense vegetation absorbs noise. Distances are deceptive. What sounds close might be half a mile away. What sounds like multiple speakers might be one person's voice bouncing off rock faces. I know this, but this did not follow those rules. The voices seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. They would swell in volume from my left, then fade and re-emerge from behind me. Not echoes, separate instances, like multiple radios tuned to the same station, but slightly out of sync. I stood completely still, listening, trying to isolate any actual words. The sounds had the shape of language, rising and falling tones, pauses that felt like sentence breaks, but no distinct phonemes, no recognizable vocabulary. I called out again. "I can hear you. Where are you?" The voices stopped immediately. Complete silence for perhaps 5 seconds. Then they resumed, but different now, slower, more deliberate. The tonal quality had changed from conversational to something more structured, more intentional. I pulled out my phone and started a voice recording. The voices continued for another minute, then stopped abruptly. Complete silence. Even the normal forest sounds, bird calls, and wind through branches seemed muted. I played back the recording immediately. My own breathing was clearly audible. The rustle of my jacket as I moved, the click of my phone buttons. But underneath faintly, I could hear what I had been hearing. Except on the recording, it was clearer, more structured. The tones resolved into something closer to actual speech patterns, not words I recognised, but phonetic fragments. Repeated syllables, M-A-R-R-C-U-S-S-S, my name again, but broken apart, deconstructed into raw sound. I played it 3 more times, listening carefully. Each time the pattern was the same. The syllables of my name spoken by multiple overlapping voices, stretched out and distorted, but unmistakable. The recording quality was poor. Background noise partially obscured the voices, but there was no question about what I was hearing. Something in this forest was producing sounds that approximated human speech, and it was specifically producing the sounds that comprised my name. I thought about natural explanations. Certain bird species can mimic human speech, parrots, myna birds, ravens to some degree, but those are learned behaviours requiring extensive exposure and training. And the sounds I was hearing came from multiple locations simultaneously. No single bird, or even flock of birds, could produce this effect. Wind through hollow logs can create tonal sounds. Certain geological formations can produce acoustic effects that resemble voices, but those are random phenomena. They do not produce specific phonetic patterns. They do not repeat individual names. I saved the recording and kept walking. I had come this far. Turning back felt more dangerous than continuing forward. At least moving forward meant potentially finding answers. Turning back meant retreating into ignorance, with questions that would haunt me forever. The trail continued into increasingly dense forest. The canopy overhead thickened until very little direct sunlight penetrated. The temperature dropped noticeably. My breath began to fog slightly in the cold air. I checked my watch. It was only 3:30 in the afternoon, but the light level suggested early evening. I turned on my phone's flashlight to supplement the ambient light. The beam cut through the shadows, illuminating tree trunks and undergrowth in harsh detail. And that was when I noticed something else unusual. The trees were not casting shadows correctly. My flashlight beam hit them from one angle, but the shadows fell in directions that did not correspond to the light source, as if there were multiple suns in the sky, each casting its own shadow, or as if the trees themselves were not quite solid, not quite part of normal physical space. I turned off the flashlight. The effect disappeared. The trees looked normal again. I turned the flashlight back on. The shadow distortions returned. I was not imagining this. I could see it clearly. Shadows falling in impossible directions. Multiple shadows from single objects. Shadow boundaries that blurred and shifted when I moved the light source. I took several photographs, trying to capture the effect. In the images, the shadows looked mostly normal. Whatever was causing the distortion was not something the camera could easily record. Or perhaps it was something about human perception specifically. Something about how our brains process visual information in real time that made the impossibility visible. Chapter 4. Animal behaviour changes. The deer appeared 20 minutes later, 3 of them standing directly in the trail, perhaps 30 feet ahead. I stopped walking immediately. They did not move. This was unusual but not unprecedented. Deer in protected wilderness areas can become habituated to human presence. They learn that hikers pose no threat, but these deer did not behave like habituated animals. They did not lower their heads to graze. They did not flick their ears toward me or test the air with their noses. They simply stood motionless, watching me. Their eyes tracked my position with what felt like active attention. Not the frozen alertness of prey animals evaluating danger. Something more focused. I have encountered deer hundreds of times while hiking. Their behaviour follows predictable patterns. They startle easily. They maintain distance. They move in nervous, reactive ways. These deer did none of that. They stood with calm precision, like they were waiting for something. The largest one, a doe with a coat colour that seemed slightly off, darker than normal for the season, took a single step forward, then stopped. The movement was too controlled, too deliberate. Deer move in flowing, organic ways. This looked mechanical, calculated. I took several steps forward. They did not retreat. I took several more. They remained still. I got within 10 feet before I stopped myself. This was not normal. Something about their complete lack of fear felt deeply wrong. At this distance, I could see their eyes clearly. They were tracking me with perfect coordination. All 3 sets of eyes moving in sync, following my smallest movements. When I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, all 6 eyes tracked the motion. When I raised my hand slowly, all 6 eyes followed it. Then in unison, all 3 turned their heads to the left. Not slowly, not in the gradual way animals track movement, but simultaneously, like a synchronized motion. They held that position for several seconds, looking at something I could not see in the dense undergrowth. Then they turned back to face me. And then again in perfect synchronization, they walked off the trail to the right and disappeared into the forest. Their movements were identical, same pace, same gait, same moment of departure, like watching 3 copies of the same animal rather than 3 individuals. Like watching a glitch in a video game where the same character model has been placed 3 times but animated with a single movement script. I stood there breathing carefully, telling myself this meant nothing. Animals behave strangely sometimes. Neurological parasites can affect behaviour. Environmental factors can cause unusual patterns. There were explanations. There had to be explanations. But I did not believe my own reasoning. I had just witnessed something that violated every understanding I had of animal behaviour, and some part of me, some deep instinctual part that evolved to recognise predators and danger, was screaming that I should leave, should run, should get out of this forest immediately. I did not run. I kept walking, because the accountant part of my brain, the part that needs to understand and document and verify, was stronger than the instinct to flee. I needed to know what was happening here, even if knowing was dangerous. The bird started calling 5 minutes later. I am not skilled at bird identification, but I know the common species in this region. Varied thrush with its haunting single-note call. Stella's jay with its harsh scolding. Pacific wren with its incredibly complex song. The calls I was hearing were not any of these. They were repeated phrases, short, mechanical-sounding patterns that cycled every few seconds. The same phrase, over and over, from multiple birds in different locations. I stopped walking and listened carefully, trying to identify the species, trying to understand the behaviour. The calls did not sound like territorial defence. They did not sound like mating displays. They sounded like practice, like someone learning to pronounce a difficult word and repeating it until they got it right. I recorded this too. When I played it back and slowed it down, the phrase resolved into something recognizable. Not a bird call, a human voice pattern. The same phonetic fragments from earlier. M-A-R-R-C-U-S. But this time, the syllables were clearer, more accurately produced. The birds were not just mimicking random sounds. They were actively learning, improving their reproduction of human speech with each repetition. I counted at least 7 different birds participating. Their calls overlapped, creating a chorus of voices, all working on the same phonetic problem, all trying to say my name correctly. The forest was saying my name, not mimicking it, not echoing it, producing it through biological mechanisms that should not have been capable of human speech. And those mechanisms were getting better at it. Learning in real time how to shape sounds into language, I started walking faster. The trail continued to descend, though I had no idea where it was descending to since the lake was no longer present. The vegetation remained dense, the light remained dim, and the bird calls continued behind me, still practicing, still learning, still working toward perfect pronunciation. After another 10 minutes, I heard something new. Not birds, not voices, but a rhythmic thumping sound. Regular, mechanical, like a generator running or a pump cycling. It was coming from somewhere ahead, down the trail in the direction I was already moving. Following the sound felt like a terrible idea, but I also could not turn back now. I had committed to understanding this, to documenting it, to finding explanations, so I kept walking toward the mechanical rhythm, toward whatever was producing it, toward the center of whatever impossible thing was happening in this closed section of forest. Chapter 5. The Research Installation. I found the research station where Crescent Lake should have been. It was temporary construction, prefabricated panels and canvas shelters arranged in a rough rectangle around a central equipment area. Power cables ran from a portable generator to various monitoring instruments. Solar panels were mounted on adjustable frames. Everything looked recently assembled but currently abandoned. The generator was running. That was the mechanical sound I had heard. A diesel unit mounted on a wheeled frame, exhaust stack pointing upward, control panel showing steady operation. I could hear its low rumble and smell the sharp tang of exhaust, but there was no one present, no vehicles, no indication of how recently the site had been occupied. I approached slowly, calling out several times. "Hello? Anyone here? I'm just a hiker. I'm not trying to cause trouble." No response. The equipment was still active. Computer monitors glowed inside one of the shelters. Sensor arrays blinked with indicator lights. Data was being collected in real time, but no one was monitoring it. The entire installation had the feeling of a ship abandoned mid-voyage. Everything still functioning, everything still powered and operational. But the crew had simply vanished, left their posts without shutting anything down, without securing the site properly, without even locking the doors to the shelters. I am not proud of what I did next, but I need to be honest about my actions. I entered one of the shelters. It was configured as a workspace, with folding tables supporting laptops and external hard drives. Papers were scattered across surfaces, maps of the forest marked with coloured annotations, printed data charts showing fluctuating measurements over time. I did not touch anything initially. I just looked, trying to understand what was being studied. The equipment labels identified electromagnetic field sensors, soil conductivity meters, atmospheric composition analyzers, and something called bioelectric gradient monitors. None of this made sense for standard environmental research. Environmental studies typically focus on species surveys, water quality, soil contamination, that sort of thing. This equipment was measuring electromagnetic fields, electrical gradients in soil, atmospheric ionization levels. These were not the tools of ecologists, these were the tools of physicists, of people studying fundamental forces in energy fields. One of the laptops was unlocked and displaying a live data feed. I leaned closer to read it. The screen showed multiple graph lines tracking various measurements. Most meant nothing to me without context. But one line was labelled Ambient EM Response to Vocalization. It showed spike patterns that correlated with timestamps. I checked my watch. The timestamps were wrong. They were approximately 18 minutes behind real time. I looked at other screens. All of them showed timestamps that did not match my watch. Some were ahead, some were behind. The discrepancies ranged from 12 to 23 minutes. But all of the equipment was networked to the same central computer, which displayed the current time as matching my phone exactly. Time was being recorded differently by different instruments, or time was passing differently in different locations. Neither possibility made sense according to any physics I understood. Time is time, it flows uniformly. Clocks might drift slightly due to mechanical imperfection, but properly calibrated scientific instruments should all show the same time within milliseconds of each other. These discrepancies were enormous. 23 minutes. That was not measurement error. That was something fundamental breaking down. Some aspect of how time itself was functioning in this location. I found a stack of handwritten notes on one of the tables. The handwriting was rushed, nearly illegible in places. I skimmed through several pages trying to extract meaning. Phrases jumped out. Root network response suggests directed growth patterns inconsistent with known tropisms. Linguistic pattern recognition far exceeds baseline expectations for simple stimulus response mechanisms. Avoid prolonged verbal interaction. Response amplification increases exponentially with continued exposure. Recommend immediate evacuation until we understand transmission mechanism and potential cognitive effects. The last entry was dated 4 days ago. The note ended mid-sentence. If the bioelectric field is using human neural patterns as a template for its own organizational structure, then every person who enters becomes a new source of... That was where the writing stopped. The pen was still on the table next to the notebook, like someone had been writing and then suddenly stood up and left without finishing their thought, without even capping the pen. Just abandoned it mid-word and walked away. I picked up the notebook and flipped back through earlier pages. The entries went back approximately 6 weeks. They started clinical and objective, describing baseline measurements and establishing control parameters. But as the dates progressed, the tone changed. The writing became more urgent, more concerned. The researchers were discovering something that frightened them. An entry from 5 weeks ago noted the first detection of unusual EM patterns. The researcher, someone named Elizabeth, wrote, "The patterns are too regular to be geological, too complex to be random. They show clear structure, almost like communication. But that makes no sense. There's nothing here that should be capable of generating organized EM signals." 3 weeks ago. We've started correlating EM patterns with human activity in the forest. Every time someone speaks aloud near the sensor array, we see immediate response spikes. The forest is reacting to human voices, not just detecting them, responding to them, differentiating between individuals. It knows who is speaking. 2 weeks ago. The plant growth measurements are impossible. We've documented 30 centimeters of new bark growth in 72 hours on trees that typically grow less than 1 centimeter per year. And the growth is not random. It's forming patterns, shapes. We need to call in specialists. This is beyond our expertise. 10 days ago, we made a mistake. We should not have been talking so much near the sensors. The response is accelerating. Yesterday I said my daughter's name, and this morning I found it spelled in moss formation on the lab tent. Perfectly legible. 6-inch letters. This thing is learning our language, and it's learning fast. 4 days ago, the final incomplete sentence. Then nothing. The site abandoned. The generator still running. The equipment still collecting data that no one was reviewing. Chapter 6. The Mimicry Hypothesis. I photographed as many documents as I could, working quickly. My hands were shaking. I was violating federal property, potentially contaminating a research site, and I did not care. I needed to understand what was happening. One document appeared to be a formal report, though it was marked draft in red letters across the top. The title read, Preliminary Assessment of Anomalous Bioelectric Phenomena in White Pine Sector 12. I photographed every page. 37 pages total. Dense technical writing interspersed with data charts and annotated photographs. The report described environmental monitoring data collected over a 6-week period. It began with routine measurements showing normal baseline conditions, background electromagnetic fields consistent with Earth's natural EM environment, soil conductivity readings typical for volcanic composition with high organic content, atmospheric ionization within expected ranges for forested environments at this elevation and latitude. Then approximately 19 days before the closure, the instruments detected unusual electromagnetic fluctuations originating from underground. Not geological, not from known sources. The pattern suggested organized activity, rhythmic pulses, coordinated waves spreading through the soil in ways that resembled data transmission. The research team had initially suspected equipment malfunction. They replaced sensors, recalibrated instruments, moved monitoring stations to different locations within the study area. The readings persisted. Then they began correlating the electromagnetic patterns with other environmental factors. What they found was impossible. The patterns intensified when researchers spoke aloud. The forest was responding to human language. Further investigation revealed that the response was not random. Specific words produced specific EM signatures. Names produced the strongest responses. The longer a person remained in the area speaking, the more precisely the forest could reproduce their speech patterns through environmental mechanisms. Wind moving through branches at specific frequencies, insects modulating wing vibrations to create tonal sounds, small animals producing vocalizations outside their normal repertoires. One section of the report detailed an experiment. A researcher named Thomas had read a children's book aloud while standing near the sensor array. The Very Hungry Caterpillar by Eric Carley. The EM readings showed immediate intense response. Within hours, the sounds of the forest had begun reproducing phrases from the book. Not perfect reproduction, but recognizable fragments. Very hungry. 1 apple. Still hungry. The forest had learned content from a children's book in a matter of hours. Content it had heard exactly once. The report included a hypothesis section that made me stop reading and look up at the forest around me. The hypothesis was that the forest itself had developed a form of distributed intelligence. Not one organism, not one consciousness, but a networked system using root structures, fungal networks, and bioelectric signaling. The trees, the soil, the underground ecosystem had created something computational, something that could process information, something that could learn. The mechanism proposed was based on mycorrhizal networks, the vast underground web of fungal filaments that connects trees and facilitates nutrient sharing. These networks are known to transmit chemical signals between plants, warnings about insect attacks, responses to drought stress, resource distribution patterns. It is well-documented science, but this network had apparently developed beyond simple chemical signaling. It had created something more sophisticated, an electromagnetic communication layer running through the same physical infrastructure, using the ionic gradients in soil and root tissues to generate weak electrical fields that could encode information, store information, process information, and it was learning from us, from our language, from our names, from the way we thought. The report noted that growth patterns in tree bark had changed in response to frequent verbal interaction. The trees were physically reshaping themselves based on linguistic input. Given enough time and exposure, the system could potentially reproduce any pattern it was taught, including the structure of human cognition. The implications section was particularly disturbing. The authors suggested that what they were observing might represent a form of xenobiology, life operating on principles different from conventional biology, but still recognizable as organized information processing systems. The forest had spontaneously developed something analogous to a nervous system, a brain, consciousness, or perhaps it had always been there, operating at timescales too slow for humans to notice. And recent environmental changes, increased carbon dioxide levels, altered precipitation patterns, warmer temperatures, had accelerated its metabolism, sped it up enough that it could now interact with human timescales, could respond to our voices fast enough that we noticed it responding. The final section recommended immediate closure and restricted access. The authors argued that increased human presence would accelerate the learning process. Every hiker who entered and spoke aloud provided more data, more examples, more patterns to absorb and replicate. They suggested that the intelligence was not hostile. It was simply doing what any intelligence does when exposed to a new information source. It was trying to communicate, to understand, to build a shared framework. But they did not know what would happen if it succeeded. They did not know if human consciousness could safely interact with a distributed biological intelligence that existed as an entire ecosystem. They did not know if the exchange of information would be one-way or bidirectional. They did not know if humans who spent too much time communicating with the forest might themselves be changed by the interaction. The report ended with a recommendation to evacuate all personnel and establish a wide perimeter until a proper scientific protocol could be developed, until experts in multiple fields could assess the situation safely. But the site was abandoned. The researchers had left without following proper shutdown procedures, without securing their data, without even finishing their final notes. They had fled. That was the only word that fit. They had fled in panic from something they had discovered or experienced, something that had frightened trained scientists badly enough that they forgot their professional responsibilities and just ran. And I was standing alone in that same location, reading about the thing they had run from. Chapter 7. The first direct interaction. I should have left immediately. I should have walked back to my car, driven to the nearest town, and reported what I had found to authorities. That would have been the reasonable thing to do, the safe thing to do. Instead, I stood in the centre of the research station and spoke aloud. Can you understand me? The wind stopped. I do not mean it decreased. I mean it ceased entirely. The constant background rustle of leaves went silent. The air became perfectly still. Like the entire forest was holding its breath, I waited. Nothing happened. Just silence and stillness. I tried again. "My name is Marcus. I know you've been trying to say it." This time the response was immediate. Every tree within my line of sight moved simultaneously, not swaying, not bending in wind, but contracting. The branches drew inward, leaves clustering together, creating patches of shadow between areas of filtered light. The shadows formed shapes, letters, M-A-R-C-U-S. The forest had written my name in light and darkness. Each letter was perhaps 20 feet tall, formed by the precise positioning of thousands of leaves across dozens of trees. It lasted for approximately 5 seconds. Then the branches relaxed and the letters dissolved back into random canopy texture. I felt my heart beating very hard. I felt the weight of my body in a way I never had before. Every cell suddenly conscious of its own existence, every nerve ending reporting its status. I was hyper-aware of being a biological system, a collection of organized matter that somehow produced consciousness. And I was facing something else that was also organized, matter-producing consciousness, but in a completely different configuration. "How are you doing this?" I asked. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Too loud, too small. Both at once, the wind returned. But it was wrong. It came from multiple directions simultaneously, creating overlapping pressure waves that cancelled each other out in some places and amplified in others. The sound it produced was not the normal rush of air through vegetation. It was phonetic, syllables, fragments of words. Patterns, growth patterns. The forest was telling me it controlled its own growth patterns, that it could shape itself deliberately, that the bark letters and shadow words were not tricks or coincidences, but intentional communication. "Are you conscious?" I asked. "Are you aware of what you're doing?" The branches moved again, this time forming words letter by letter in sequence, the shadows spelling out. Learning. Not a yes, not a no, an explanation.